Okay, looks like we're streaming. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Just making sure it's picking me up, okay? So let's take a look at our assignments. So assignment number 2 is due this Friday. Make sure that you get that finished. Keep in mind that in the middle of lecture, last time I had to make a couple of adjustments so that it fit more closely to the class example. So keep that in mind. Go by whatever is written inside a Blackboard, not if you pause like a frame on the lecture to read the assignment. Don't do that. Just go directly to Blackboard. Okay, we don't have a whole lot of time to go back over that, but just keep in mind the due date, and if you have any questions about it, go back to the lecture from last week. You have a new assignment due in, I think, again, a week and a half. Yeah. So not at the end of this week, but so 10 days, essentially. The way this assignment's going to work, it's going to be a little bit different. It's a website, and you essentially just play a game. It'll make sense once we get to that part, but rather than attaching screenshots, rather than attaching source code, you attach screenshots. And the reason I started moving to this game in the past couple semesters is because we're going to cover a topic called Flexbox, which is kind of advanced, and I've noticed a lot of people had difficulty really getting a grasp of it, and I feel like this, rather than doing a very large assignment where you might get confused, this game gives a pretty good sense of how it works and the most common usages of it. But also note, because it's an easier assignment than normal, it's worth only 5 points. We're going to do the same thing with a subject called grid. And again, it's one of those things that a lot of people had difficulty really understanding. So these next 2 assignments are only worth 5 points because it's a little bit simpler of an assignment. Okay, so I think that's it for that. Let's go ahead and get started. Let's create a folder for today. Open the brackets. File, open folder, CGS4828 and 922. Under links, we'll go to HTML shell. And then from now on, what we're going to be using is this include viewport meta. We're going to just be including that in every single example from now on. We don't always need it. It's just a good, the times we do need it, it's just easier to have it available than going back and trying to add it if we didn't. So go ahead and paste that in. This will be example 1. And that's your starting point. So while you're getting set up, I'm going to start to talk about this topic right here, Flexbox. Okay. So there's 2 different sites I have available. This one has a bunch of examples. I'm not going to rely on this one so much, as this one's a pretty good resource. When Flexbox was first released many years ago. This is actually where I got most of my information, and to this day it still remains probably the best resource on Flexbox. So the way so Flexbox pertains to layouts when you're trying to lay out content on your page. And the tools we had up to that point were not super great. So originally, about all we had was tables, and so people were trying to put their entire site inside of a table. That didn't exactly work great. And then we got some CSS layout stuff with Float. And Float, you can do layouts. It tends to work better for the example we did, like a newspaper article where you have a picture and then you want to wrap some text around it. It works really well for that, and because you can kind of disrupt the normal flow, you can kind of make a 2-column layout, but it's not super great for that. And then past 2 columns, you can actually technically do more than 2 columns. It's just, it's very awkward. It's not very natural. So what started to happen maybe 10 years ago, probably a little bit longer, we started to see these CSS frameworks that were wrappers around Float and some other techniques that made grid systems and other layout techniques much simpler. And then they sort of used that as a learning experience to say, okay, what are people actually trying to do in HTML? How do they want to make their sites look? And then they eventually created a standard with 2 layout techniques, the first of which we're going to talk about this week, with Flexbox and Grid. Now, what's the difference between the two? Well, I haven't talked about Grid just yet, but in general, Flexbox is when you want to go in a single direction. So say, for example, your site's navigation might be a good example, like up here. This would be a perfect example of when to use Flexbox. Grid is when you want to go in 2 directions. So what I mean is think of almost like an Excel spreadsheet. Like if I wanted to lay out your entire site, and I might have, the good example I like to use is the Audubon Society. I haven't been to the site in a while. Imagine it's still basically a grid layout. And notice here that we're kind of aligning things in 2 directions. So we have, this might be taking up 2/3, 1/3, and then these grid cells are evenly spaced, but then this one might be. So you get the idea. Here we're kind of laying things out in 2 directions. Now this is a fairly simple grid layout. In practice, you can get much more complex. Off the top of my head, the one I think that I've seen that does the most complex thing is maybe the New York Times website. So, but we'll talk about grid more next week. So this is more if you're going in one direction, just like a simple navigation. You're not doing things over multiple rows. And the basic idea is that we've got a container and the items in that container. Okay, so let's go ahead and set up some CSS that we're going to use over and over and over again. Create style, and we're going to have a class called container. Just like we had here, and then we're going to have our items within that container. So we'll just call our other class singular item. Now to turn on Flexbox and actually use it, to enable it, we have to set the display flex property. Now let's actually go ahead and do this. I'm maybe getting ahead of myself a little bit. Let's go down to body, and we're just going to set up an example container with items. So we're going to have div. And so this will be our container. So class is equal to container. And then we'll have a bunch of divs that are of class item. Now in the real world, usually this is something like I mentioned, a navigation or something more concrete. But because we're just going to be worrying about the layout part of it and not getting too involved in the actual content just yet, we'll just use the div for everything. Make sure we're still streaming okay. Everything's good. Perfect. Okay, so you get the basic setup is that we've got some container and a bunch of items. Now notice that we're not even bothering putting anything in here like lorem ipsum text or anything. Some of these examples don't always show very well with just plain text. So what we're going to do is with an item, let's essentially make a box. Okay, so we're going to have width, height. Now again, we generally don't set height, but for this example to work, we'll set height. But usually once you have real content, using width is very common, but height is not super great because it's very easy to overflow the height. And just so when we have content up side by side, let's go ahead and set a border radius. And that just kind of rounds out the corners. Some sort of green for the background color. So it looks good. And let's give it a border that we can see. So we'll just say the border is 1 pixel solid. I think it defaults, I don't know what it defaults to, but we'll see a border. I think that's enough just to get started. Try to run updates. No. Now what you'll notice is that it's displaying in a row, which is actually not the default. If we didn't have display flex set, this is how it would normally display. So already you can see there's something a little bit new happening here. So again, we'll set display is flex. And we have this property called flex direction, and by default, it's set to row. So as you can see here, by default, it's set up in the row direction. Now, there's different properties that you set on the parent and the individual items. We haven't set anything interesting Flexbox related on the items. All we've kind of done is just kind of set up a box here. And you can see here, it's essentially just a box. So we have display flex. Here we have flex direction. So we can either go in the row direction or the column direction. Now, I'm not going to cover super advanced things related to Flexbox because I've been using it for maybe 5 years now. To be perfectly honest, there's like a small number of use cases that you use it over and over again. Things like reverse and stuff like that. I think the game actually has you do some of those things, but in practice, they're not that often used. I want you to know they're available, but I don't want to use up class time going through like every single thing. I just wanted to take you through the most common use cases. But as you can see here, we can go in the reverse direction and actually reverse them, but we don't really care too much about that. So by default, it's row. Well, what happens if we set it to column? You can see here that it went in the column direction. Now, Flexbox is kind of interesting because, and we'll get to this later, we don't really think of things really in terms of like width and height anymore. We think of things in terms of what's called the main axis And so sometimes you'll hear me accident. So I think the official terms are main access and cross access. And because there's other software systems out there that actually copied this or were influenced by this, a lot of them use the terms primary access and secondary access. Sometimes you'll hear me accidentally say that because there's other systems I use. I'll try to stay to main access and cross access. Now the main access and cross access actually switch based on which direction you're going. So if I'm going in the row direction, this is my main access. And if I'm going in the column direction, this becomes my main axis. That's why we don't call it like X or Y, because it flips based on which flex direction you're going. There's the property here. I think I have an example that I'll do later in class today showing flex wrap. To be perfectly honest, I don't use it that often. I don't find it super useful. I think Grid has other ways to handle wrapping content a little bit better. Let's talk about one here called justify content. So this defines alignment along the main axis. In this case, our main axis, let's set it to row. So flex direction, row. And so if we set it to row, this diagram lines up. And so what we can do is, by default, notice that everything's on the left. But notice we don't use terms like left, right, top, bottom, that sort of stuff. We use start, end. Center is still valid because it doesn't really matter the direction. But in this case, because we're in the row direction, it happens to be left. But if we were going in the column direction, it would be on top. Same thing here with flex end. Here it would be on the right, but if we were going in the column direction, it would be at the bottom. Let's experiment with some of these a little bit. So let's set the justify content. And by the way, this is one that I use almost constantly, so good to know this. And the two that I use most often are space around and space between. So let's look at space around. What happens is that on both sides, it evenly distributes space. Okay. I use this very frequently if I'm doing a site navigation. And between space around and space between, I think most of the time I kind of just default to space between. There's times that you might use space around, but space between tends to work pretty well. And it puts the space in between the items, but notice at the start and end, it does not. Now, one thing you might think is, okay, so we tried it with row. Let's try space between with column. And you'll notice that didn't work. And the reason it didn't work may not be super obvious, but that's about all I want to do with that example. So let me set it back to row. Okay, so you have just this alone. This is a very common use case that you can use over and over and over again for doing your layouts. Just knowing display flex and justifying content is incredibly useful. Now, to avoid having to type a bunch, what I'm going to do with a lot of these is just copy. So Command A, Command C, file, file new. ex2.html. The item is going to generally be the same in every single one of these. This setup at the bottom is going to be the same. And then we're going to change some things inside of container. Okay, so make sure that you copied and pasted from example 1 into ex2.html. So I started to show you that, so I'm on example 2, that this works fine in the row direction, but in the column direction, it's not quite working right. Now with this brackets built-in web server, it kind of does some extra stuff that I don't want to deal with right now. So what I'm going to do is just open this up in a regular web browser, no special web server or anything running. And I'm going to open up our developer tools. So in Firefox, it's web developer. Chrome has something similar. On Safari, there's like a whole set of steps that you have to go through to enable it. Once you enable it, you never have to do that again. To be perfectly honest, I don't do a whole lot of web development in Safari. So I can't really say. I know in the past I've tested some sites with their developer tools, and I just remember that specifically you have to go through a set of steps to enable it. So I'm going to go to Toggle Tools. And in this case, it probably makes most sense on the right. So let's go ahead and do that. Now, when I hover over body, this sort of makes sense what's happening. It's filling up on the primary axis. It's filling up, I'm sorry, the main axis. I'm already messing it up. It's filling up as much as it can. Now remember how block level tags work is that with block level tags, they take up the entire row. They take up the entire width. And that's why that works. Notice here that as I hover over this div, I've got this blue area over here, sort of implying that it is actually taking up the entire width. But by default, these don't take up the entire height. So what we have to do is within the body, we have to say, okay, normally you're going to want to take up only the height that you need to, but I'm going to force you to take up the full height of this thing called the viewport. Okay, so the way we set that is we say that for the body, the height is going to be 100% of the, we don't actually use the percent operator, of the viewport height. And so now, so under body, I set the height to be the full viewport height. The viewport is essentially the screen. And if I refresh, I hover over here, and now notice that the blue takes up the entire height, so blue is the content, but it's still not quite working correctly. Why? Notice that this div still only takes up as much as it needs to. So now we have to go back here. Now the reason we can't just say 100%, I'm pretty sure just 100% doesn't work, is because it's kind of complicated. Here we're actually saying, okay, for our viewport, our actual screen, our available screen space, force that to the height. Once we've done that, for any child elements, which in this case container is, like, look, if we go to here to body, and we go to this div is a child of body. So once we've forced the body to the full viewport height, then what we can do is we can say, okay, height is going to be 100%. So take the full percentage height, and then now if we refresh, notice that it works because the body is the full height, the div is the full height. We don't see any, okay. So if you're going to be doing things in the column direction, always keep that in mind. That's a very common mistake. It's something if I go a few weeks without having to do anything, or maybe months in the column direction, sometimes I have to remind myself, oh yeah, I have to actually expand to the full viewport height. Now remember, so this is in the main axis direction, and space between, when it's set to row, is going to go in this direction, but because we set it to column, it's going to go in the other direction. Same thing if we said, say, set it to flex end. Before, we might have said, oh, justify content to the right. But because we're setting in the column direction now, the main axis is flipped. And notice it's actually, if we were to describe it, it's on the bottom, but essentially it's the end of that axis. Okay, so that's why we tend to use terms like start and end rather than left and right and top and bottom. And even the whole concept of width and height sort of doesn't have as much meaning. We'll get to that toward the end of the class. But let's just set it to back to set it to space around, since we did space between last time. Okay, so if you want to evenly distribute items in the column direction, this is the method to do that. Okay, any questions on that? Good. Okay, so let's start another example. And let's copy and paste from example 1 again. So Command A, Command C, and then paste in here ex3.html. Now, I may want to do some things in this example that require the full viewport height. So let's do this. We'll say body, the height is 100 VH for the viewport height. And let's remove this height property, because in this example, what we're going to do is actually fill in some lorem ipsum text as our content. So we'll go over to, so again, I just removed the height. By the way, having the height isn't actually very common. That was just so we could basically get a box. And let's go to, must have forgot to put a link. Anyway, it's very easy to search for. Just ipsum. And just a single paragraph. We can I think I want to do this. So in this case, I want them to be different lengths. So have maybe a short. And that's very short, so we'll make this one just one sentence. And then have a couple that are kind of long. If you make these all the exact same, the example doesn't really work that well. And I think I'm going to go slightly smaller. Can you still see that okay? Okay. So we've got a container and a bunch of items. And now in these different items, we've got text of different length. We've also removed the height because that's really no longer necessary because we've got actual real content now. Now you'll notice that with this background, we're able to see the actual real height of each div. So we just talked about justify content. There's another property called align items, if we can find it here. And if justify content is the behavior in the for the main axis, align items relates to the cross axis. So by default, I think the default is stretch. And so what happened is the actual content is at the top, and then the div itself that we can see because we have this background, that actually is the full, it's stretched essentially. No, I'm trying to avoid using terms like height. Well, let's see what happens if we set it to, say, flex start. And we don't really need justify content. So under container, I'm going to get rid of justify content. We could actually have both if we wanted to, but just to make the example a little bit simpler, I'm going to set it to align items. And so we'll start with flex start. Notice the actual text is still aligned to the top, but the actual size of the div has changed. Let's see what else we can do here with this. You can set it to center, which I think tends to be the most useful use of this. And it'll actually center align these. This tends to work well if you have content that's of slightly differing height. Maybe not this different, but if you've got something like a couple of things that are maybe slightly different sized image or slightly different sized fonts, you can align them to the center. And then we also have baseline, which aligns the baseline of the text. Let's go to end. This is another that's very useful, is that we've aligned things at the end of the flex in the cross axis. Now, like I said, the most common that I end up using is center, and I'll show you an example of it in a minute. So I'm trying to go through this kind of slow because this is, I think, for most people very new. I think a lot of the things that we've done in class already, you've already gotten from other classes, but so to enable all of this, we have to set display, flex, and then we have the concept of the main axis and the cross axis. And when it's set to row, this is going to be the main axis, and this would be the cross axis. When we set it to column, this becomes the main axis, and then this becomes the cross axis. Now, I'm not going to really talk about reversing it, but it should be fairly obvious. We'll get to wrap in a little while. Now, alignment related things is that we have justify content, and justify content aligns in the main axis and basically says, okay, what do I do with extra space? And this flips, as we've seen before. So this is an example when the main axis is row, but if we were to flip it to column, then we'd see that essentially they reverse. Same thing here, align items. This is on the cross axis. So if this is set to row, it's how they align in this direction. And then again, if we were to set it to column, everything would flip. I'm not going to probably do an example with aligned content, but if you've got enough content that it actually starts to wrap around, you can actually, if you want to look on this on your own, you can see things. I don't even think the game does anything with that. Okay, so let's do file new. Let's copy and paste example 1. And let's set the viewport height again. So we'll say, because I know for sure in this example we're going to need the viewport height to be full. So we'll say the height is 100, essentially the full height. And then if you remember, inside of our container, we had to set height is 100%. In this example, I want to center something perfectly in the middle of the screen. Now, if you just want to do things in the width direction, that's actually not that tough of a thing. You can, depending on what you're doing, you can set, you can make a fixed width div, and then you can set the margin to auto, or if it's something text or text-like, you can do text align center. So getting things centered in the left-right direction of the page, that's not actually not that difficult. However, for a long time, getting things centered in the width direction and the height direction, that used to actually be kind of a complicated thing. Enough to the point that I wouldn't even bother. It was just enough of a problem I didn't even bother doing it. People had different copy-paste type code out there, but I don't usually like to resort to that if I don't have to. And what we can do is we can set the, let's get rid of these extra items because all we need is just one. And so what we can do here is set display flex. By default, it's going to be row, but just to remind you that the default is row, I'm going to leave this here. Justify content. So we don't want to use space between this time. We want to center it. Notice we get this, which was already fairly simple to do. But notice, because we had this additional property called align items, and there's something here called center, I can actually center it vertically. In this case, it's going to be vertical because of where our main axis is. And so if I set both of these, so justify content center, align items center, I can actually put something perfectly in the middle of the screen. This is really cool because what you might actually want to do is something like I think I can just do something like this. Okay, if you just want to put, and you could adjust the size of this and everything, but if I wanted to just put text right in the middle of the screen like this, I can do that now. Before it was just, you'd have to do all kinds of things, maybe with some absolute positioning, maybe some JavaScript. There's a few different techniques, but now it's just extremely simple. You just set the viewport height to make sure that we've expanded the full height, and then set it to display flex, and center it both in the main axis and the cross-axis direction. So kind of a cool thing. It may not seem that cool, but it is if you had to use the old methods and you had to jump through a bunch of hoops just to do something super simple like this. Okay, so let's, so that's setting everything on the container class. Let's start to talk about the individual items, because right now all these items have been essentially treated the same. So let's go back and copy and paste from example 1. So Control A, Control C, paste it in with Control V. So we're going to keep the item mostly the same right now, except for we want to do one thing. Rather than setting it to width, we're going to use a variant of this called min width. Min width says essentially it can be more, but this is the minimum width. It has to be at least 200 pixels. So here's our example 5 right now. And it may seem kind of strange because you're like, okay, these are 200, these are each 200 pixels. So what's the difference? Well, we have an additional property called flex grow. And this is like unitless. You'll see in a minute. This is more like a proportion. And what this is saying is I want these to grow equally. And that's what's happened, is that as the page changes size, these are all going to grow equally. This is kind of nice because we can do some basic responsive design without having to resort to media queries like we did last week. So let's go over here. I don't personally use a lot of the ordering stuff, but I think your assignment does. But just so you know, you can actually set the order on these individual children. But let's talk about flex grow. So we've done here, so let's read through this little blurb. This defines the ability for a flex item to grow if necessary. Okay, so this whole if necessary, that's why we had this min width, is because it can grow more, but it has to be at least 200 pixels. So it accepts a unitless value that serves as a proportion. It dictates what amount of the available space inside the flex container the item should take up. If they're all set to 1, it's just going to be distributed equally. So let's do this. So let's comment this out. I don't like to delete code. So I don't know if we ever went through this, but if you want to comment out code, you do /*. It's basically comments are little notes that you leave to yourself. Usually I don't talk about them much in these classes because we tend not to comment CSS very often. But this just means that the code's not going to run. It's just like a little note for yourself. This becomes more interesting if we start setting flex grow to different sizes on different items. So before, every single item was set to 1 because we set it up here. But let's do this. Let's do an inline style, and let's set this. So we'll set this one to 1, and we'll just alternate. We'll go 1, 2, 1, 2. So this one will be 1. This one will be 2. So 1, 2, 1, 2. So when we're at a point that they're all 200 pixels, so each one of these are 200 pixels, 2, 4, 200, 400, 600, 800 pixels. And that's because we had the minimum width. But once they've reached that minimum width, how do we want them to grow? Well, these are going to grow twice as fast as these. And you'll notice that as we start to grow, they're going to grow at a rate twice as fast. Doesn't really necessarily mean that they're twice as large. It means that they're growing at a rate twice as fast. Okay. Kind of an interesting thing that we're getting some basic responsive design without really having to worry about media queries. It's just like as it grows, do this. Now, to be perfectly honest, I don't very often set things at the item level because grid tends to be more practical for a lot of different problems. I tend to use Flex most often when I have navigation is probably the best example. It works really, really, really well on various navigation alignments. But okay. So that's that. That's Flex Grow. Defines the ability to grow if necessary. We have another here called Flex Shrink. Defines the ability for an item to shrink if necessary. So let's I think we can just copy and paste this example. So rather than going all the way back to example 1, let's copy this. This will be example 6. And we don't really need this. And rather than having min width, let's just set it back to width and just have our box like we did before. And rather than growing, let's say how this is going to shrink. So going back to the definition here, defines the ability for an item to shrink. So right now, this isn't really an issue because we're saying, okay, all of these are going to have a width of 200 pixels, not a min width, but just a width of 200 pixels. And so, okay, we've got enough room. That's not an issue. It's when we start to run out of room, so these are each 200 pixels, so when we've got less than 800 pixels, what do? Well, normally what would happen is that we would get that scroll bar to scroll left to right because it would say, hey, I need 800 pixels, I don't have 800 pixels, so you're going to get a site that scrolls left to right. But this is cool, again, as a responsive design technique because we're saying, this is the rate that these need to shrink. And at some point, it just can't shrink anymore. But notice that the second and fourth items shrank at a rate twice as fast, meaning that they were half the size. And that looks about right. This seems to be twice as large as this. So the rate at which they shrink was twice as fast. Then finally, we have flex basis. So this defines the default size before the remaining space is distributed. Now, personally, this is probably better than using, like we've been hard coding the width. We tend to want to use things like flex basis. Why? Because this applies to the, it would be in the primary axis direction. So when we get into where we're flipping things, when we set between row and column, all these are defined based on main axis and cross axis versus width and height. So in general, when we're using Flexbox, we actually try to avoid the keywords width and height. We try to use flex basis. But sometimes I'll catch myself doing it because in reality, you don't actually often flip back and forth between row and column. It's like once you've set something. Now, one technique that you can use is with media queries is that you can flip from row to column on, like, say, a navigation or something like that. Maybe we'll do something like that next class. I think this is about all I want to cover this class. So let's talk about flex basis. So let's do an example. And we'll just copy from example 1. That one was a pretty good default. So the ex7.html. So we don't really care about justify content in this example. And rather than having, so the height is just kind of a, so we get a box. But like I said before, we don't want to use the term width. What we have instead is flex basis. Okay, now it may seem kind of like the same thing as we had before, and they're all shrinking equally, and then once they get their 200 pixels, everything's great. But we can use this with another property called flex wrap. Now again, I don't tend to wrap content very often. Usually I like to use grid if I'm going to get into where things are going across multiple, if they're wrapping around essentially. But you can, there's no reason that you couldn't. So what this does is it says when we run out of room, essentially, so by default flex items try to fit all onto a single line. You can change that and allow the items to wrap as needed. So let's go back here, and inside of the container, let's set this property called flex wrap, and by default it's just, there's no wrapping, but let's set it to wrap. And now the behavior that we get is that once we've run out of room, so think like maybe a mobile device, it wraps around. Now, I personally don't like to use this very often because many times it's like you have a little bit less control. A lot of times you'll end up with content like this that's maybe not like symmetric in a certain way. And I think there's ways to have it grow and do other things. But to be perfectly honest, we have something else called Grid, which is very, very good at handling this second row of things. Now, I don't want to discount it. I'm sure a lot of people that are better at this stuff than me have come up with very clever ways of using it. Just for my own projects, I tend to like to use Flexbox for mostly when we're just dealing with a single line of things. I don't tend to wrap that often. And if I'm going to get into that, then I usually just resort to Grid. Okay, and that's really all we're going to do with this. Oh, then there's one property here called flex. And this actually, I don't use the three individually very often. I don't use grow, shrink, and basis actually very often. What I'll often actually use is this one that's just called flex. And this is another one of those unit lists where we just put like 1 or 2, like we did with grow and shrink. And this kind of combines them all and sets behavior on growing, shrinking, and flex basis. So it's really nice, and it just kind of, it's like one of those things that just work correctly most of the time. I did want to show you the individual things, but in practice I just tend to use this one here called flex, and it's a combination of all three of those. Yeah, so the default is 0, 1 auto. It is recommended that you use the shorthand property rather than the individual properties because it sets the others intelligently. And that's what I've noticed, is that it actually works just on its own pretty well without having to set the individual things. Okay, so that's Flexbox. Let's do the like a quick 2-minute overview review. So Flexbox is our first real modern introduction into layouts. Like, you can do layouts with other techniques. Like we had created a fixed width div and then maybe set margin auto, and that kind of gets us something in the center. And then from there, maybe we can have a float right and float left and make a 2-column design. And that sort of works okay. And I'll still use that every once in a while. If I just need something simple in 2 columns, sometimes I will actually use that because it, but there's kind of a steep learning curve for Flexbox. So if you are kind of new to it, you can always resort to those older techniques. And then, so this tends to work well when we're going in one direction with like 1 line worth of content. We're going to have grid, which tends to work when we're going in 2 directions, when we care about the row and column or the main axis, cross axis. And then we have a outer container, which sets behavior for the individual items inside of that. So to turn or to enable Flexbox, we just set display to flex. And by default, we get this property here, this flex direction, gets set to row. Now, you probably saw in the previous examples, I like to actually set it myself just to be super clear. But by default, if you didn't put it, it would just have set it to row. And we have this concept of primary axis and cross axis. Now, when we're set to flex direction row, this is going to be the primary axis, and this will be the cross axis. When we set it to column, this is going to be the primary axis, and this is going to be the cross axis. And we don't tend to really talk about things in like X and Y coordinates or like or width and height. We talk about things in terms of their main axis and cross axis. So justify content works along the main axis. And so this is when the main axis is set to row, these various diagrams. But if you were to set it to column, you could just flip them into the column direction and it'd work the same. Now, one thing to note, that when we did set the flex direction to column, that we had to use the expand the viewport height to the full height, because by default it only takes up as much as it needs to. But once you've done that, then you can start to go through these. We also had align items, and align items works on the cross axis. So this is when, again, we're set to row. If you had it set to column, just flip everything. Now, some of these are a little bit unclear without some text, so we went through and we put some text and we kept our background color. And to be perfectly honest, the one that I most often tend to use is probably center, maybe a little bit of end if you want things to land at the end. There's another here that we didn't really talk about that aligns the baseline of the text. Okay, so if you've got various sized boxes, which probably works well for what it does, but I tend to use center and end a lot. Okay, and so that was examples pertaining to the container, but then we can actually set behavior on the children. And we talked about flex grow. This is at the rate that the individual items grow. By default, we could set them individually, like 1, 1, 1, like this, and they would grow at the same rate. Or we can start to just give them different values. And these are unit lists. It's more like a proportion. Essentially what we're saying here is that this item is going to grow at twice the rate as the others. We also had the same thing for the rate at which it's going to shrink. And we also had flex basis. So in our example, rather than just putting the width, because width is kind of like dependent on direction, and we try not to do that. So then we started using flex basis, which is much more in line with the terminology, because the basis changes on whether we're doing row or column. These all can be combined together into just one property called flex, and that's the most common usage, is that you just set flex, some sort of proportion, and it tends to just kind of work on its own pretty well. We also briefly talked about wrapping content, but like I said, I don't personally do that very often, just because it can get a little bit, the content always doesn't wrap the way you want it to, and you spend a lot of time trying to do things to make it wrap the way you want it to. When in practice, grid plus media queries tends to work really well. So let's look at your assignment. Now, I used to do an assignment that made you go through this whole thing and do like a whole working web page. I've gotten a little bit more understanding of your class schedules, let's say. So assignment number 2, I realize for a lot of people that can be very involved. So what I typically do is like an assignment like this where you have to do something very involved and then give you a little bit of breathing room with something like this. Now, it's not going to be worth as many points, but rather than just like assignment after assignment after assignment of very complex pages, this one kind of breaks it up a little bit. I guess I should do this as an actual link. But so there's a game here. Now, I will tell you this is a very popular game. So you could go out there and find the answers. This is kind of on the honor system. If people start doing that, I'm going to pull the assignment and then give you something difficult. So this only works if everybody's on the honor system. I have caught people cheating in the past, and it's like it's just disappointing because everyone in here is supposed to be a senior, and many of you are graduating this semester, and it's just disappointing that at this point in your academic career that you might want to cheat. So I'm going to be honest with you. It's a very popular game. You will find the answers if you really look. Don't do that because it defeats the purpose of it. And if people start doing that, I'm just going to pull the assignment and I'll give you something that you're going to have to do on your own. Okay, so just kind of the honor system on this. And the basic way it works is that you've got some lily pad here, and you have to put the frog onto it. So this is static, this is fixed, you can't change this, but what you can do is change where the frog is. So they've got an ID here called pond, and pond is the container, and they've set it to display flex, and then you might say, okay, well, I can move the frog around in this direction along because by default the direction is going to be row, along the main axis using justify content. So let's say just justify content, and maybe I want to set it to center, and notice that it'll move the frog to the center. But it should be very obvious that, okay, if I want to get them all the way over here, I've got to put the frog at flex end, and then once you've completed it, go to next. Now, I don't make you do the whole thing, and then you go through here, and two frogs, same type of deal. I don't make you go through every single level. You just have to complete the first 13. And then once you've completed the first 13, if you click here for the drop down, it'll show these all green for being completed. And then take a screenshot. Make sure when you take the screenshot, and I give you some directions on how to do that on a Mac. On Windows, it's pretty simple. It's just there's a tool called Snip that you can look up. It's pretty easy to use. Make sure this is actually dropped down. I don't want you to, because you can just click any level and say, take a screenshot and try to say, I'm not going to accept that. You have to actually go here, and I want to see all these are green, okay? Hopefully that gives you a little breathing room. In the past, people really liked it because it's just kind of a fun way to learn this without having to get into the weeds of making a bunch of web pages. Okay. So next time we're going to get into grid, and then maybe an example, navigation with Flexbox. I love doing navigations with Flexbox just because it's made life so much simpler, and you can do very cool navigations where you can like have the your links on the right third of the page, and maybe just like on the middle have like a site title, and all the way at the left have something else. Because we can actually put Flexboxes inside of the other Flexboxes, which we'll do probably next class. But works really, really, really well for navigation. Footers, it works pretty well for as well. Doesn't really work for entire site layouts. Like you can do it, and I saw some people doing that for a while before we had grid standardized. But the thing that we're going to go over next week, grid tends to do that a little bit better. Okay. So I think that's pretty much it for today. We only have a few minutes left. Do you have any questions? You're good? Okay. So for those watching at home, make sure I didn't drop any frames. Perfect. We stayed connected the whole time. Send me an email, and then keep an eye on your assignments. Make sure that you remember that assignment number 2 is due this Friday. Remember that I changed a couple things in class, so don't go by like a screenshot that you might have taken from the video. Actually go into Blackboard and go to the assignment and make sure that you go through all these. And the reason I changed it is because I wanted it to closely match what we did in class. So I just changed the phrasing of a couple things and then added this. Okay. So if there's no questions, make sure to keep an eye on the announcements in case anything happens that I need to announce. Email me if you have any questions, and I guess that's it. Stay safe, and I'll see everybody next week.